We are so thrilled today to be able to have Dr. Archie P. Cubarrubia with us. He serves as Deputy Director of Institutional Transformation at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He leads the team responsible for understanding how colleges and universities transform themselves to dramatically improve their performance and eliminate race and income as predictors of student success. Archie has worked to improve student success and institutional effectiveness for over 2 decades and from multiple vantage points, from institutional leadership to federal policy making to state policy advocacy. A lifelong student advocate and national expert on post-secondary policy programs and data, he has held leadership roles at the U.S. Department of Education, Miami-Dade College, Northern Arizona University, the University of Rhode Island, Boston University, and Partners for College Affordability and Public Trust. He earned his bachelor's degree in health studies and a Master of Education in Policy Planning and Administration from Boston University, and his doctorate in higher education administration from George Washington University. So I'm thrilled to introduce to you Dr. Archie Cubarrubia.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. Apologies, I will have my notes on my phone, so I'm not checking Twitter, just as a heads up. First off, Mark, thank you so much for these. These are great for the bike, but also they might be great for the social hour later today, so might bring them later. So, all right, let me start this up. So I'm going to confess something to y'all. I did that thing where I was working on the deck, presentation deck, and I did not practice with the animations. So it's going to be as much a surprise for me as it is going to be for you. So join me on this ride. First off, thank you so much for having me because I am super excited to be here and to learn from all of you. It's been about 4 years since I've been on a campus, and I miss it. And so thank you for letting me learn vicariously through your experiences. Like many of you, I suspect, I got bit by the higher education bug as an undergraduate orientation leader. And the joke is I never left the field. My first job out of grad school was to coordinate Lumberjack Welcome Week and FYE 101 at Northern Arizona University. It was called Lumberjack Welcome Week because we were the Lumberjacks. At that time, I was too busy doing the work, and I'm sure many of you can relate, that I didn't realize that I was part of a bigger student success movement. Fast forward to serving as a staffer for the Spellings Commission, which kick-started the national conversation about college completion, to working as a designated federal official for Secretary Arne Duncan's advisory committee for measures of student success, which resulted in the inclusion of non-first-time, full-time outcome measures in iPads. So that's where that came from. Yes, I know. If you've ever talked to somebody and said, oh, but they only have first-time, full-time grad rates in iPads, tell them to correct their talking point because we now have outcome measures for non-first-time, full-time students in iPads. And then most recently serving as Vice Provost for Institutional Effectiveness at Miami-Dade College, where I oversaw IR accreditation, strategic planning, and assessment. I had the chance to see firsthand that what we're doing is, yes, we are teaching our courses, yes, we're implementing our student success programs, yes, we're running our enrollment reports and providing critical analysis. But what we're building towards is a more equitable society for students, their families, and our communities. I really appreciate the great work that the consortium has been doing over the last 25 years, and thank you so much for that fantastic work. One of the unique things, one of the unique things that the consortium has done, I don't know if you've noticed this, is they brought together a cross-functional group of folks. If you've attended a conference at AIR, Nakubo, EDUCAUSE, for example, those conferences are great, but you tend to talk to other IR people, other IT people, right? Other business affairs folks. This is one of the conferences where you get to talk to the whole set of folks that are dedicated around student success. And that's amazing work. It's like, I don't know, we're organizing ourselves around student success as opposed to expecting the students to organize themselves around us. Spoiler alert, that's what my friend and colleague Dr. T. McNair is going to talk about tomorrow. But that's a shift in the field that we want more and more of our colleagues to do. And then finally, before I dive in, I want to appreciate you for all that you have done for your students over the last 2.5 years. I know that it has not been easy. The work has never been easy. Some days are harder than others. I also want to appreciate that you're here, because the fact that you're here, and kudos to Trinity for having 13 people here, which is amazing. You're the proverbial choir, but you recognize that sometimes members of the choir need to refresh its playlist. Sometimes you need new sheet music, or sometimes you just need to explore new collabs with people. And so thank you for being here. So from where I'm standing in philanthropy, and even when I put my former federal policymaker hat on, it's the people who show up, and I do mean show up, to events like these that make me think, yes, our students are in good hands. So thank you for being here. Okay, that's the inspirational part. Here's the dry, boring part. Hopefully it's not dry and boring. So here's what we're going to talk about today. I was telling Jessica that thank you for this opportunity, because here's what we're going to do. We at the Gates Foundation have spent over a decade learning about the conditions that help facilitate student success for particularly our racially minoritized students and low-income students. And we've been making all of these investments, but what we haven't done is try to actually put them on a table and see, hey, what have we actually found over the last decade plus? And does it make sense together? And so what I'm planning to do is share what we've learned, share a little bit about what we've been up to at the foundation and what we're going to do next, and hopefully leave you with some resources. If we have a few minutes left, I'd love for you to talk at your tables about some thoughts and some lessons learned that you have experienced at your campuses. Now, I think we're gonna make this version of this slide deck available to you after, and so you don't need to jot down notes. And I intentionally put a lot of material, so just as a heads up. Okay, as I mentioned, over a decade of investments. So at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we believe that every person deserves the right to live a healthy, productive life. In our work in the U.S., we're focused on helping people navigate the U.S. education systems and job markets so they can develop the knowledge, skills, and agency needed to thrive in their communities. In post-secondary success, what we're focused on is a North Star. And that North Star is where many more of today's college students can achieve a credential of value. And what we're talking about is equitable value, which I'll talk about shortly. We're also envisioning a North Star where race, ethnicity, and income are no longer predictors of achieving those credentials. These are some of the investments we've made over the past decade. Some of you may be familiar with some of these because some of your institutions were part of these engagements. Some of you may not, which is good, because one of the things that we found is that sometimes when there's a branded initiative, it sometimes takes over kind of all the great work that you're doing on campus. But let me run these by very, very quickly. We started our work in 2011 learning about what whole college reform looks like by partnering with 9 community colleges in those 3 states, Ohio, North Carolina, and Florida. Interestingly, one of them was Miami-Dade College, where I eventually ended up working. And what we did was we literally found kind of what was going on with institutions and the students going through there. Some of you then may be familiar with Guided Pathways. So we helped fund the work that Tom Bailey and his folks at the Community College Research Center did on Guided Pathways. And we funded work by the American Association of Community Colleges to provide institutes related to those, to implementation of Guided Pathways. And then most recently, we set out to learn from 29 colleges and universities and 2 state systems who were at the frontier, hence the name Frontier Set, and who were willing to go out on a limb about what makes a difference in equitable student success. That initiative is sunsetting this year, and so we are in the middle of wrapping up our evaluation of that particular effort. The Post-Secondary Value Commission is a commission that the foundation put together a couple of years ago to basically establish for the field, what does equitable value look like for the field? As you can probably imagine, many students and families are asking, is college worth it? And when people think about what college is worth, many people come up with different answers. And so what the Value Commission did was put together a methodology for calculating value and then putting together an action agenda. And then we have a whole list of individual investments to execute a learning agenda about institutional transformation. It's so fascinating because when I joined the foundation about 3.5 years ago, I did not realize the machinery behind the learning. And it's actually very intentional. It's interesting because I don't know how many of us on our campuses have as much of a robust agenda that's about learning. When I was back at Miami-Dade, I tried to do what I called an annual research agenda for IR. So we did all the compliance-y stuff, because you have to do the compliance-y stuff. But then we took everything else that our student success colleagues were thinking about, and then everything else that was top of mind based on our strategic plan and everything else that was going on. And then we tried to construct a research agenda for the campus, for the college, and so that we could align all of the research activities for the year related to that. It helps a lot to have an actual piece of paper, kind of like a syllabus, to help that. Okay, so let's jump on into what we have learned. I did not put it on this slide, but here's the giant disclaimer. These are not the final findings. But we have enough confidence in our observations from our work with institutions and our evaluators that we are willing to share them with you. So, yeah, feel free to take some screenshots if you'd like. And like I said, we're going to share a couple of these slides with you at the end. There we go. Lovely animation. Okay, why transformation? Again, like I said, you're the choir, so hopefully you don't need much convincing about why institutional transformation is important. If you have been observing what's been happening in the field just in the last 3 to 5 years, you know that there is something not right in the way that higher education as a system has been set up and in the way that we are implementing our work. Many students, and we know the kinds of students that are typically shut out of higher education, and we also know the type of students who don't make it past the gate. The pandemic and the racial justice movement, and even the backlash we're seeing now in many of our states, I think are revealing, I think what we've all, particularly those of us in higher ed, have seen to be true. And that in some cases, higher education has actually not been built for equitable student success. That is tough to hear for somebody who switched majors. You probably heard I was a health sciences major because I was going to be a physical therapy major. But then as an orientation leader, I was like, wait, you could do this for a living? So I decided to abandon that plan and decided to stick to higher education is all I know. And so after 2 decades in higher education, to be stared in the face of what higher education has not lived up to, I would say, was very sobering for me. And I was feeling inklings of this before the pandemic. Here's my why. Let me share you about my why, and I'm going to ask you to reflect on your why, and why you're here, and why you're in the line of work that you do. Because we know that higher education professionals are not the most compensated people, right? So we're doing this because we want to. And number one, nobody majors in higher education and undergrad. Like nobody. You're here because somebody made a difference in your career, in your undergraduate life, your graduate life, or your career, and said, hey, working at a college or university, or working in higher education is important. And you're like, yes, I'm going to sign up for that. So let me share you my why. My why was being part of the commencement stage party at Miami-Dade College. I don't know how many of you have had that opportunity. It is so fulfilling. The joke is they told us, hey, the commencement ceremonies are like 3 hours long because we have to read every single name. If you're the type of person who falls asleep, don't do it. And if you have to get up to like go to the bathroom, do not do it. So we're like, okay, so I think I can hang on for 3 hours. But seeing the joy on people's faces as they walk by you, all shapes, all sizes, all ages, all races, amazing. And then I started thinking 2 things. What about the students who are not walking on the stage? And then number 2, I started thinking about what it took to get them there. What it took them, and then what it took the institution. I don't know about you, but some days at work, I was like, why are we working so hard? If we're here for the students, why are we trying to organize ourselves in a way that doesn't reflect that? And so my why was, we have to figure out a way to get smarter at this, because there are institutions that have figured out how to do that already. So let me pause for 2 seconds and have you think about your why. So we do have findings about why transformation is important. And I'll talk about what transformation is in a second. But here's what we found. Transformation produces more equitable and sustainable outcomes than by implementing individual point solutions alone, especially if those point solutions go away when funding runs out, or when the campus champion for that point solution leaves. One of my former roles at the U.S. Department of Education was a compliance officer for Title III, Title V grants. So I know many of you here have Title III, Title V grants. The way that the regulations are written, you can literally almost do anything with Title III, Title V grants. And it is fantastic that there's that much flexibility. Here's the challenge that I saw when I did those site visits. Sometimes those funds were used to fund, yes, I'm going to call it this, shiny objects, right? Shiny objects that you implement on campus that are not connected to a strategic plan, to a strategic vision, to an umbrella, right, about student success. So that what happens as soon as the Title III or Title V funding goes away? It goes away, or it sits in a corner. Some kind of sustainability planning is not really thought about. The other thing that happens is the champion leaves, right? So either the president, the provost, the vice provost, the person who said, yep, we're going to do this, leaves, and then suddenly that initiative is gone. The second piece that we found in our work is that transformation provides institutions a method for organizing, prioritizing, and planning efforts to ensure that those efforts don't remain shiny objects, but that they're intentionally embedded into the proverbial, that's just the way we do things around here. The key word here is intentional, right? So as you know, most institutions are made up of the same kinds of units. Most institutions have academic affairs, most institutions have student affairs, most institutions have business affairs, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, that's because accreditation requirements have those kinds of units. You have to have these kinds of things. Now, what we found that the secret sauce or the special sauce is how those things are put together on behalf of their students. I'm hoping you're sensing a theme, right, about how things are. The third thing that we found about why transformation is that it facilitates and sometimes, in some cases, forces institution-wide action. Now, one of the things, I was at a convening last week of institutions that we were putting together, institutional representatives that we were putting together for another effort. And I heard the term red light, green light people. I don't know if you've heard this term. Like, yeah, when I'm doing a thing, I think about people on my campus are going to be red light people or green light people. Now, I'm not telling you to go and label people on your campus, right? But I suspect that you already know who on your campus are champions, who are the potential hurdles, and who are the neutral people that you need to convince. Right, so you already plan like, hey, I need to do this thing, I need to do this initiative. Here are the folks that I need to do kind of a world tour of this initiative or idea of. What we found is an effort that's cross-functional or that's institution-wide, like a transformation effort, can facilitate that kind of institution-wide action because it breaks down silos. And then finally, what we found is that a transformation effort can leverage multiple campus initiatives and minimize initiative fatigue. Here's how we found it does that. Every time somebody tries to pull together or to implement something, the folks who are implementing goes, wait, is this a new thing? But we just did the thing 2 years ago. It usually goes better when here was the master plan, and this thing that you're implementing is actually part of that broader master plan. We literally just waited 2 to 5 years to get to that thing. This quote from Indian River State College, who is part of our Frontier set, actually perfectly exemplifies why the transformation piece is important. They talk about operating within a culture that's intentionally structured to enable employees to expect and welcome intrinsic and extrinsic change. This approach significantly reduces resistance to new initiatives by employees, allowing us to shorten the time necessary to scale new student success models. So, in over a decade's worth of investments, what we found about why transformation versus shiny object implementation works is that you actually help establish the institution's muscles and agility to respond to stuff. Let me say that again. Transformation helps institutions build its muscles and agility to respond to stuff. I don't know what your pandemic experience was like at your institution. The switch from in-person to digital, for example, or to organize around protocols for closing and opening. What we observed is that institutions that had cross-functional student success teams already established had an easier time to create those protocols and to make the switch than to start from scratch and create a culture where folks from academic affairs could sit at the same table as folks from business affairs. Okay, I promise you a working definition. So we at the foundation needed a working definition to guide our investment making. So what we did was we worked with institutions in our frontier set, and then with experts around the country to draft a definition. Then we took it on the road, and we had people kick the tires on it, and then we drafted it again, and then we shared it with more people, and then we drafted it again. And in fact, this is a working definition, and we're going around the country saying this is a working definition. Now, I will tell you that our goal was not to create the definition. And in fact, you should be thinking about your institution's own definition. Our goal was to basically say, hey, what are the things that we think are super, super critical for institutional transformation to happen so that we at the foundation can start investing in some of these things? Okay, the top line, because we're the Gates Foundation, we can't just do one sentence. There's two sentences. The top line is the what. The bottom sentence is the how. So we think the transformation is a realignment of an institution's structures, culture, and business model to create a student experience that results in dramatic and equitable increases in outcomes and educational value. We were very intentional about structures, culture, and business model because we saw over a decade's worth of work that those shiny objects, for them to actually take root at an institution, guess what needs to happen for them to take root? They need to get institutionalized in the budget, in policy manuals, in org charts. For them to become the way we do things around here, they need to actually show up in those things. And I'll talk a bit more about that. And then we found, by observing many institutions, that how institutions transform is by integrating evidence-based practice that create inclusive and coherent learning environments, and then leveraging the student-centered mission, catalytic leadership, strategic data use, and strategic finance in a robust continuous improvement process. That second part is a bit of a word salad. You can probably imagine the process we took. If you've done strategic planning on your campus, you know that you have to like, oh yeah, that word has to be in there. Oh yeah, that thing has to be in there. We also wanted to make sure that everybody could find their place in a definition. So hopefully you're able to see where some of your units live. Okay. So at the Gates Foundation, we like to define things, we like to codify things, because we're very kind of technology driven, and we like to kind of break things down into pieces. We said, okay, if you take transformation, let's try to break it down into different elements. So I'm going to share with you some of the common elements we've seen across transformation. The first is this clearly articulated theory of action about how an institution centers its resources around the student and not the other way around. Let me put a pin on that, because I will talk about that in a second. The second is some institutional readiness for transformation. And that can be demonstrated by committed leadership, financial resources dedicated to transformation, and the ability to use data strategically. Now, this is something that we've been actually having internal discussions about, and I suspect some of you at your institutions are having some discussions as well. Do you need to be at a certain point before you can embark on a transformation journey? Or can you take where you are as an institution and say, you know what, we're going to take steps anyway? It's the same kind of philosophy that you might apply, let's say, to students that are coming in that might be enrolled in developmental education classes at your campus. We believe that an institution can make progress toward transformation regardless of where they're starting. People always say, but institutional transformation costs money. It does. So here's the thing, I'm going to be super, super honest with you. It's going to cost money. And in fact, a study by CCRC found that, for example, implementing guided pathways, which is a whole college reform construct, costs about $450 per FTE to start and $350 per FTE to maintain. Now, you make that money back by retaining students, and so you actually, which is good, because it's cheaper to retain students than it is to recruit students, but you still need that initial investment. But remember what I said earlier about identifying things that you're already doing, leveraging the multiple initiatives that you're already doing. There's already stuff that you're doing on your campus that could help propel your trajectory towards transformation. And I'm going to share a little bit about what those elements are, but that's what we're finding, is that institutional readiness, which is why it's quotation marks, doesn't mean you have to do all of these things first. It's not like a prerequisite to have these things. These things help facilitate it, but you don't have to have all of them to get started on your journey. The third thing that we found that's common is that these institutions are part of networks where they can learn from each other and get support. So congratulations, you have one element at least, because you are here as part of this network of institutions and are getting ideas for best practices, getting connected with other institutions that are doing the great work. And then the fourth is policy and data enablers at the local, state, and national levels. That includes money from state appropriations. That includes things like improvements in the data infrastructure. So if your state has a longitudinal data system, ways that you can leverage that to improve the work that you're doing. Work that's happening at the federal level to connect to data, for example, that's available through the college scorecard and others. So these are the four elements that we've said, okay, if we've looked at all the institutions we've worked with over the last decade, here are the things that are popping up consistently. All right, let's go back to the first one, the clearly articulated theory of action. All right, let's do. I know this is super dry, so I apologize. So let me invite you to take a look at the diagram. And instead of looking at it as a diagram, think about it as a cinnamon roll. Imagine that you're looking down, maybe you're watching British Bake Off. The Halloween episode this past week was great. So let's say you're looking down. Think about the center circles as the different layers of the cinnamon roll. Think about the gray box that says institutional decisions as a doily, perhaps, where the cinnamon roll sits. And then the contextual factors as the plate that holds the cinnamon roll. We love baked goods at the Gates Foundation, so this helped a lot. When I say a theory of action about institutional transformation, what I mean is, do you know how your institution is supposed to be organized and to operate to help a student make it from recruitment to matriculation to enrollment to graduation? Let me ask that question again. Do you know how your institution is supposed to be organized and how to operate to help a student move from recruitment to admission to matriculation to enrollment in courses? You can add financial aid in there, to graduation. Now, there's a difference between, yeah, this is how we do things, and there's also, this is how it's supposed to work so that a student can get through that process in an optimal way without wasting their time or their money. Have you looked at your excess credits reports recently? We know, and again, we've observed this, that institutions are not always organized around the student. Some institutions have done fantastic work creating one-stop shops. Fantastic. That's great. That's one component. If you think about the life cycle of the student, again, from start to finish, and some institutions have done even beyond. So through career advising and beyond. And in fact, some institutions want the beyond part from an alumni connection perspective anyway. Do you have a vision for how that ought to work? So that vision is going to look very different for your institution, depending on the community you're in, depending on the identity of your campus, depending on your mission, depending on the students you serve. But what we have found is that institutions that are able to articulate what that through line is, and institutions that are able to get everybody else on the campus to articulate what that through line is, have a leg up. Because what makes a difference there? Each person in the org chart knows how they contribute to the institution's student journey. The institutions that have organized themselves around the student journey, great, but we know that sometimes moving your org chart around, not the easiest thing to do. So even if you don't actually, let's say, blow up your org chart for a number of reasons, and for some institutions it's not feasible at all, but do you have that vision to do it? So that's what we're talking about here, which is an integrated framework for transformation. So in the cinnamon roll that we have, if you join me on this visioning exercise, at the center of the cinnamon roll is equitable student success. Around it is some kind of perspective about that student experience from matriculation to completion. So that becomes the kind of the basis for the student journey. And then around that, we call it solution areas here, but that's where the shiny objects can plug in. Right? So how does EAB, how does Civitas, how does your campus classroom optimizer software, where does that plug in so that it contributes to the student journey? It's an amazing exercise. It's super freeing as well to help students, help institutions see what stuff contributes and what stuff doesn't. Right? We talk about, hey, we just pile on more stuff to the stuff that we do, and we don't actually take stuff off. Here's an organizing framework for you to say, does it contribute to equitable student success or not? And then have people plug in. And then the blue ring around it are the operating capacities and routines that enable the effective implementation, tracking, and improvement of those solutions and the student experience. In our parlance, that includes the functional units like leadership, like institutional research, strategic finance, information technology. I would throw in human resources in there. I would throw in facilities in there. Again, it might look different on your campuses, but the idea is the operating capacities animate then the implementation of the solutions, which tie directly to the narrative or the storyline, through line that you expect your institutions to go through. Does that make sense conceptually? The reason we did it as a cinnamon roll is not just to make you hungry, but that's also helpful. But what you can do, and we've seen this work on a campus, is you can literally cut the cinnamon roll, let's say one corner, and then unfurl it. And then you can see layers, right? Where there's like a green section, an orange section, and a blue section. And you could even align it to here's what you expect to look like at a student's first year, second year, third year, fourth year. And then here's where we see our academic advising system contributing. Here's where we see our financial system contributing, etc. This is what we saw helped institutions move forward in their transformation. Now, they did not call it an integrated framework for transformation. This is the Gates Foundation putting like language around what they were doing. But intuitively, institutions that were transforming knew that they had to do some kind of organization around it. So how do we know that we're transforming? We could do something super simple, like take the definition of transformation, like you could almost do kind of a one-to-one. If we take a look at structures, culture, and business model, you could take a look at, hey, what are we measuring? I'd like to know changes to what's on paper and then changes to what's not on paper. You could probably think about, if you were to measure changes to structure, culture, and business model, you could probably imagine what you would look for. Similarly, if you were to look for changes to student experience, you probably would think of things that you would want to measure. And then similarly, you would want to think about what you would look for if you are interested in increases in outcomes and educational value. Here's the giant asterisk, though. We know that an institution's transformation journey is, in fact, a journey. There's not an end point. And many of our institutions have told us this. We actually followed the 9 institutions in completion by design since 2011. So we have longitudinal data on what happened to those institutions, both not just from a student KPI side, but also just operationally, what happened. As you can imagine, lots of staff turnover, so lots of those champions leaving. And guess what we're tracking for? Are the changes still there, or have they been improved upon since the champions left? Again, that's how we know that the things have sticking power. What we ended up finding is that, again, we like to codify everything, so apologies. Initiate, incubate, iterate, and sustain are phases of transformation that we find institutions kind of constantly going through a cycle. Where an institution could be a phase of initiating, where there might be a unit on your campus that's doing really, really, really awesome stuff, like transformative stuff, student success stuff, but it has not yet got to the point where you're bringing 13 people to a conference. It might be one person, and then I'm going to take that back to my campus. I'm probably going to have to find a way to get myself a seat at the table to convince people that this is a good idea. Or you might be at an incubate stage where you're like, okay, we have some good ideas. I have buy-in from a couple of folks on campus. We just need time and space to do stuff and convince people that this works. What we found is that a lot of the transformation work and a lot of the student success work is still voluntary. Like, for a lot of you, this is other duties assigned, right? And so one of the things we're trying to figure out is, okay, how do you make that not just incubate? And then the final phase is iterate and sustain. So you created a cadence of continuous improvement for your transformation journey, and you're sustaining it, and it's improving. That's when something like a pandemic hits, and then your institution knows how to quickly move to address it. Now, we have a few examples here. I'm not going to go through every single one. Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, Jackson State University, and HBCU in Sinclair in Dayton, Ohio as a community college. Again, we follow these institutions, and thank you to these institutions because they let us into their business. This is what happens when you work with the Gates Foundation. Let us into your business, and we follow your work. I don't want you to get bogged down in the catalysts and the key changes that they did, because if you take a look at those catalysts and key changes, you might see some key words that you're like, okay, yeah, that's happening on my campus. Or that's not happening on my campus. What I want you to take away from this is that it is not a single thing that contributes to transformation. It is a lot of things that contribute to transformation. Let me say that again. It is not one single thing that contributes to transformation. It is multiple things that contribute to transformation. And so here's where I really invite you here, and when you go back to your campus, to take a look at what's happening on your campus that you can leverage now. What's happening on your campus that you can plug into that through line, that student narrative, the way it's supposed to work for students, so you can say, yep, we're going to claim that for the equitable student success work. They don't know it yet, but we're going to claim it for that work. I'm going to take not so few seconds on equity. And then I'm going to close. Here's the big finding that we have on equity. Equity doesn't happen by accident. I think we know this intuitively, but we have data to prove it, number one. What we found is that institutions must design for racial and socioeconomic equity if they want to achieve equitable outcomes for students. You as an institution can transform, absolutely. And you can still miss the boat on equitable student success. You could have all the components I shared. You could have all the elements. You could implement it. You could spend all the money in the world. And then, when you look at your student success data, go, yikes, ruh-roh. And why is that? It's because we did not think about embedding equity in the beginning. So we did, like I said, we followed our completion by design institutions longitudinally. Good news there is that they met their target outcomes 3 years in advance. So they were doing some really, really awesome stuff. But when we went to dig in, like good IR folks, we disaggregated the data. We found that the initiative closed gaps for Pell students. It did not close gaps for students by race ethnicity, because we did not design for it to close gaps by race ethnicity. 10 years later, we're like, oh no. It's like when you do home improvement and you're like, oh no, I used the wrong tools, or I used the wrong materials. So some of our completion by design institutions actually went back to redo the initiative and called it equity by design to ensure that they address the needs of students. particularly students of color. Now, the thing that I want to note is that this will look differently for each institution, but it really begins with an understanding that we're asking our students to join our communities. And the communities are not always welcoming to them. And so there is a piece about, and which is why we stuck the word culture and student experience in our definition. There is an acknowledgement, and again, it'll look very different for each institution, so I invite you to think about what this looks like for your institution. Because again, you can implement all the engineering stuff, the technical stuff, but there is a piece about the culture and how students feel on the campus that you cannot do by implementing academic advising. You could have awesome predictive analytics dashboards, fantastic. It still won't help the way a student feels on your campus. I want to say that out loud because we forget that sometimes. Because we think that by doing this thing, it'll result in the thing. Very quick story. I told you we took our definition of transformation on a roadshow, and it was super awesome to hear the alignment on the definition. They're like, yes, absolutely, transformation, great. And in fact, we got pushback on this awesome word in red, realignment. Some folks said, yeah, that's not strong enough. Realignment is like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. Right? Because you're realigning things on an already shaky infrastructure. So they said, why not use reimagine? That allows us to think outside the box of what that could look like for students. And so our next rev of this definition might actually not use the word realignment. The other piece, though, that came out during that conversation was an acknowledgement that for many of us, and in many communities, many cities, many states, talking about equitable student success is still a risk, and it's still a challenge that creates potential professional consequences. And that was, when I heard that, that was very sobering to me and heartbreaking to me at the same time, but I also knew where they were coming from. I know you're all here because you want to do great work for the students that you serve, and we know the work that needs to get done to help them be successful. But we found out that we need to be intentional in that work, and sometimes that intention will make you run into walls and make you run into electric fences that are not fun. And so, as you think about what equitable student success looks like on your campus, I invite you to remember your why. Somebody else on that campus, on that convening, when we were doing this roadshow, said, yep, there's risk to us professionally, but there's also risk of inaction. What about the risk to the students of maintaining the status quo? I can't tell you what your risk tolerance is for this work. I couldn't have predicted when I started out as a lumberjack welcome week coordinator all those years ago, that this is really the work. I thought I was scheduling, how to feng shui your dorm room sessions, which I did, which was fantastic, well attended, great. But that was one piece of this broader work that we're doing on equitable student success. So, what's next? You may have seen from the Gates Foundation that we are working to scale what we've learned so far. Again, we're not done learning, but we've learned so far, we think, that we are partnering with 6 intermediary organizations to work with up to 250 colleges and universities to help accelerate their own transformation journey. And so we committed $100 million over the next 5 years to work with 6 different of those intermediary organizations to take the elements of what I just showed you and basically test it out. See what works on campuses, see what doesn't work on campus. Commercial, some of you may be part of this effort. So stay tuned because the intermediaries, some of them are ASCU, UNCF, Excellencia in Education, may be reaching out to you. We're going to continue to learn about transformation, continue to innovate on those solutions, and continue to work on data and policy to promote equitable value and affordability. Here's my pitch to you. Please, please, please let us know what great work that you are doing on your campus, because like I said, we are very interested in learning more about what's happening on campus and how we can be supportive. Some resources for you. Again, we'll make this available, but in case you are interested in getting a preview, for each of the main initiatives that we had, we documented everything. So all the institution stories, take a look at those stories and what they did. The 4th bullet, the guide for post-secondary changemakers, actually includes a summary of what we do. You're going to see the cinnamon roll in there. So, spoiler alert, bless you. You're going to see the cinnamon roll in there. And then we created worksheets for those cinnamon rolls. So if you like the cinnamon, this is terrible. If you like the cinnamon roll and would like to apply the cinnamon roll on your campus, we created worksheets that you can take and use with you on your campus to see how you might organize yourselves around equitable student success. Bless you. Okay. Here's where I stop talking, because I've been talking a lot. And here's where I hope that the last few minutes of the conversation have helped trigger a couple of thoughts for you about how you approach the work. And so what I'd love to do is maybe spend a couple of minutes around your tables sharing what you've learned about institutional transformation from your work on student success. I've placed 3 kind of guiding questions. You can choose any of them. One being, if you had a definition of transformation, what would it be? What would it include? What would it not include? Second would be, how does equity show up in your work, or does it? And then the third is, so this is the interesting part. When we visit campuses, they keep telling us about this special sauce. There's always a special sauce. If somebody were to bottle this special sauce, would you know what the ingredients are for your campus? And where would you start? All right. Talk to each other, talk amongst yourselves, and then I'll bring you back. All right, I'll give folks about another minute. All right, thank you so much. I know this is, I love the energy. I know, I do this. Does this work? There we, it needs some club music in the back. There we go. I see that table's got it. Thank you so much. That was fantastic energy, y'all. I hope that you had some good conversation, and I hope that you got started on the start, not the end, the start of good conversations over the next 2 days about what equitable student success means for you and for the institutions, for the institutions here today. Again, I want to just thank you on behalf of the foundation, because you are doing the work that we don't often get to see. And so I really appreciate the work that you put in, day out on behalf of the students that you serve. I know that it's very rare to get recognized for the work, particularly outside our institution, so I want to thank you for that. My contact information is in the attendee list, so for real, that was an invite. If you are doing some really cool things on your campus, please feel free to send a note, because we are not done learning about transformation. You saw the frameworks that we're talking about, so you see kind of where we're thinking about learning a little bit more, but I'll also be around at the conference if you'd like to talk some more. So thank you so much, and I look forward to talking with you more.